begin by talking about the night that I fell in love with my wife. I was in my late 20s. I was in New York, and I was working at a company called Killer Films, and I was involved in a secret office romance with a woman named Jocelyn. And it's involved a lot of late night furtive meetings and, glances towards each other during the day. And we talked about things we love. We talked about books a lot, because we both love books. And Jocelyn was passionate about young adult literature, YA. And she would often make the argument for YA as literature, not YA as a gateway to literature, but as literature itself. And one night we were talking about the books that we loved as kids, and we started talking about Judy Blume. And Jocelyn announced that her favorite Judy Blume book was Blubber. Blubber, for those of you who don't remember, is about an overweight middle school girl. And I sort of scoffed at Jocelyn's choice of Blubber as her favorite Judy Blume. I thought it was minor Bloom at best, certainly no super fudge. And she got really mad at me and argued. She said, no, Blubber's amazing. Blubber is like King Lear. And I laughed at her, and I just sort of dismissive, how is Blubber like King Lear? And she said, when you're reading Blubber, you start off laughing at this fat girl, and you're laughing with the other kids at her. And then something changes as you're reading it, and you start identifying with her. And by the end, you're crying. Blubber, she explained, is like King Lear because it starts as a comedy and ends as a tragedy. And right there, right in that moment, I fell in love with my wife. I love stories and I love storytelling, and I also like unpacking why stories work, what makes them effective. And that's what I do as a film producer. I help people tell stories. I help storytellers tell stories. And the foundation for that comes from my liberal arts education and learning critical thinking. But critical thinking started for me at a much earlier age. The introduction of the affordable consumer VCR changed my life. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas in the 1980s, pre-Amazon, pre-internet, pre-Barnes & Noble. I didn't hunt, couldn't play any sports, didn't fish. I was starved for culture. And then one day my dad brought home the VCR, and a local video store opened, and the world started to open up for me. My dad had on his shelf a book of Pauline Kael reviews, and it wasn't a collection of her greatest reviews. It was literally 1979 to 1980. And I would go with the book to the video store. I would find a movie. I would pick it out. I would rent it, watch it, and then I would read her review. And this two-step process was my first moment of critical thinking, of learning to engage with something that I was watching and learning to engage with a story. And I decided that I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I thought I was going to go to film school. I thought that would be my trajectory. I'm going to go to film school. But then I saw a movie that changed that for me. I was in New York on a trip, and I went to this art theater, the Bleecker Street Cinema, and I saw a movie called Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story. And this was a movie made by Todd Haynes that was the story of the late 70s singer Karen Carpenter told using Barbie dolls. And I went to it thinking, this is camp, this is fun, this is funny. And I watched it in the theater with everyone at the Bleecker Street Cinema, and we started off laughing at this movie. As the Barbie dolls came on screen and started talking, we started laughing. But as the movie went on, the laughter stopped, and we became engaged in the stories. And what Todd had done, which was so great, was bring you in with this conceit, like Blubber, and then hit you emotionally. He crafted an amazing melodrama. And I decided I wanted to go to school wherever Todd Haynes had gone to school. And I went to see what film school he'd gone to, and he hadn't gone to film school. He'd gone to Brown University and majored in something called semiotics. Now, I had no idea what semiotics was, but I decided right then and there I was going to major in semiotics. So I went to Brown, and this was the early 90s. It was an era of wallet chains and Nirvana and experimenting with your sexuality. And I dove into all of that. But I also dove into the cultural studies department here. And I started reading a lot of film theory and theory in general. Works by people who look like this. They also look like this. A lot of them look like this. And occasionally read something by someone who looked like this or who looked like this, but for the most part, we were reading things by dudes who looked like this. I also would, with these shows, a Godard film, I learned that Godard had declared the death of cinema in 1968, which was disturbing. I also learned that you could be critical of cinema and approach it in a critical way and still love it. One of my professors here said something to me that some of you will relate to, which is, she said to me, Brad, you can understand that the film you're watching is part of the work of cultural hegemony, and you can also still love it. Now, those words affected me incredibly in my semiotics department, but the other thing that happened here at Brown was I took classes that weren't just related to film. I took city politics and biomedical ethics and the politics of the legal system and art history. And what I didn't realize in this moment was that I was laying a foundation for my work as a film producer through the expanse of the liberal arts education that I was getting. And that by learning to be a critical thinker, but also by getting a wide grasp of the humanities, I was going to be able to go out into the world and make movies. Now, college ended, and I had to get a job. Todd Haynes had made 3 films by that point. He was working with a producer named Christine Vachon, who'd also gone here. And I can't get into this story, but I was lucky enough to end up working with them at a company called Killer Films. And we were producing some of the best, coolest independent films of the 1990s. And the amazing thing when I walked into these offices at Killer Films was that nobody was talking about film theory. They were talking about, how do we get the money for this movie? Oh my God, how are we gonna make this schedule? Who are we gonna cast? Who's gonna be crazy enough to let us make this film? And there was a shared sort of gut instinct to the type of movies we wanted to make that came from a similar place. But what I realized the liberal arts education hadn't given me, which you can't expect from a liberal arts education, is experience. And what I got at Killer, and through Christine Vachon, who became my mentor, was experience. She took me to London. We worked on this amazing glam rock opera called Velvet Goldmine. I got to work with Todd Haynes. I got to learn what it was like to physically make a movie. But I also needed to learn what it was like to talk to a filmmaker, to talk to a storyteller. And that was something else Christine taught me. Brandon Tina was born Tina Brandon. She was born biologically female, but at 18 took on a male identity, moved to a small town in Nebraska, and carried on a love affair with a local girl named Lana Tisdale. Lana would later say that she had no idea that Brandon was not biologically male. When it was revealed in this small town that Brandon Tina was actually Tina Brandon, she was raped and murdered by 2 people she was very close to. And Kim Pierce, a young director, had approached Killer and wanted to make a movie about this story. And she'd never made a movie before. And I said to Christine, how do we know that she's a filmmaker? And she said, listen to her speak. She speaks like a director. Listen to her, she tells stories. And when Kim talked about this story, she didn't talk about the true crime elements or transgender politics. She talked in terms of classics. She said, this story is gonna be like Pinocchio. This story is about somebody who wants to be a boy, who dreams of being a boy, and who everyone says is a liar, but wishes it enough that they become a boy. And when she said that, the movie unfolded in front of you. And the power of what she was saying was the power of a story that could reach a universal audience. In that moment, I understood how a filmmaker spoke, but also that I needed to meet filmmakers on that level. Killer was great. We had a whole bunch of really cool movies. It was a great experience for me, but I had to leave. You always have to leave your mentors. The mentee must, kill the father. And I moved to Hollywood, and I started working in the studio system. And my big worry was, would my skills be transferable? And the skills were to some degree. They were transferable. The ability to talk to writers and directors I could transfer, but I needed to get experience in the studio system. Same thing from when I graduated from college. It's your basis of knowledge, your way of thinking, plus experience. And I realized I was gonna be okay one day when I was a meeting at a studio where I was developing a gangster picture. And I was working with a very high-end, very fancy writer, very sophisticated. And the studio executive told us that they wanted the movie we were doing, this gangster movie, to have the themes of The Godfather and of Goodfellas. And I made a little face, and I locked eyes with the writer. And in that moment, we shared an understanding that we were screwed. And the reason we were screwed is because The Godfather is a myth-making machine. It has one of the greatest character arcs in cinema history. Michael Corleone starts off by saying, "I'm not my father." 4 hours later, the door shuts on him in his father's office, and he's become his father. It's amazing. But it also created a lexicon for gangster films for the next 20 years that no one could escape. And it created an idea of code and honor and dignity amongst gangsters. Goodfellas shattered that. Goodfellas is about a bunch of sociopaths. It is gangsters as they probably really are. Violent people with no code, living in an ugly world fueled by speed. The lead character in Goodfellas, at the end of the movie, is a rat. His transformation is to go from a guy you're identifying with to a guy who sells out all his friends to protect himself. This movie is nothing like The Godfather. And when I had this look with this director, this writer, because we were sensing it both at the same time, it wasn't a look of superiority to this executive we were working with. It was a look of despair, because we knew we were screwed, because we weren't going to be able to give this person what he wanted, because what he wanted was incoherent. The project died, but what I did know was I could work with this writer. I spoke his language. We both spoke a critical language of cinema. Nina Jacobson, who's my partner at a company called Color Force, who also is a semiotics major from Brown, and I do a series of children's films. They're based on these books, Diary of a Wimpy Kid. These books have sold 75 million copies. And they're about a kid named Greg Heffley. They're the anti-Harry Potter. He's a normal kid. He's not special. He's not gifted. He's not that bright. He acts on his worst instincts all the time, and kids love it. Kids love these books. And when we went to pitch the books, when we went to talk about them, we had to describe them to writers and to directors in the studios to talk about what we were going to make. And the way we described it was to say, this is Larry David in middle school. And literally, to get to that sentence is the result of experience over these 20 years, but also my liberal arts education, critical thinking. It takes me back, when I'm making a movie like this, to that moment when I fell in love with my life, to blubber, to understanding why a story is impactful and how you're going to tell it. I made a film last year that was about the world in chaos. It's about the fear of a nuclear Iran. It's about the collapse of nation states. And the way we made this film was very simple. It's through zombies. It's a zombie movie. And everybody should know that great zombie movies aren't just about zombies. Yes, they're about fast dead versus slow dead, and undead versus already dead, and all the things you have to think about when you're putting together a zombie picture. But Dawn of the Dead, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, is not just about zombies. It's about consumerism at the end of the 70s. And this is something that I instinctively knew, but I learned through my liberal arts education. I learned how to unpack those things. So when we were making World War Z, which will come out next year, we were thinking about having fun with our zombies. We were thinking about, really thinking about what we were saying about the world. Yes, we were figuring out how to make the zombies work and how do they move, but we were talking about the world in chaos. And I was drawing on an international relations class I took at Brown so many years ago. So there's always that joke. What are you majoring in? Semiotics. What are you going to do with your art history degree? You can do anything with these degrees. As long as you have the foundation of a liberal education, you understand that storytelling is important, but critical thinking is also important, you can live your dreams. And I don't want to sound boastful when I say that I have a great time making movies. I got to work with Todd Haynes, the person I went to Brown for, and I get to have fun. At Color Force, we're making movies that have an effect on culture, and I get to be in weird situations where I'm standing around with men dressed in little green suits and men dressed like Hasidic Jews. And it's part of my daily existence. It's part of the fun of what I do. The Bleecker Street Cinema is gone. The VCR is gone. People are consuming media in really different ways. There's just different ways of seeing. But the joy of storytelling and the joy of narrative is always going to be there. And even if cinema goes away, I plan to be part of a conversation where people are figuring out how to keep storytelling going and how to understand what makes storytelling work. I really feel that the work I did as an undergraduate laid a foundation for critical thinking that, combined with experience, got me to where I am. And however we're consuming things, whether it's on an iPad or something else in the future, I plan to keep doing the same thing that I love to do, which is watch something, experience it, love it, and then immediately try to figure out what made it work and take it apart. Thank you.